South Africa. And so it has indeed proven to be so. The challenge of transcending the legacy of apartheid has been very, very complicated. But as he said, we are trying to do this in the same time as the world is changing. Just the example of what happened to our currency about 5 or 6 years ago. We were doing well, doing all the right things, and suddenly our rand becomes almost worthless. 8 rand to the dollar, 9 rand to the dollar, 11 rand to the dollar, 12, and it had nothing to do with us. It had to do with what was happening in the rest of the world. And we know that part of the challenge we now have with respect to the most basic of resources, like food in our country, has as much to do with what's happening inside our country as what is happening outside of it. The fact that we now, as a consequence of a whole host of factors, but particularly unfortunately America's invasion of the Middle East, one important factor, and the other of course is the fact that oil or petrol is a resource that diminishes, it's fossil fuel, and it's getting less and less and less of that, and there's danger everywhere, and the speculators are operating in the way that they are, and the price of petrol has gone up to what it is. That's an external matter. So all of that does, it exacerbates, makes worse the challenge we originally had, which was just to deal with how to deal with the legacy of apartheid. And we've got this other challenge. So I put one slide on this thing to show you and to talk about, in speaking about this challenge. The slide represents, if you like, two worlds. One should not operate in binary terms, but sometimes it's more comfortable to do that and easier to make sense of things. If you were to look at that slide, to me it represents the ways in which certain organizations relate to others in the world. If you consider the big divide between the countries with old wealth and those who are quickly accumulating new wealth, and the countries that are hugely challenged financially, then that represents those. At the top would be our waterfront there, which represents the world of wealth, and at the bottom would be the world that is struggling. And we know that currently the balance is unequal. There are large numbers of people in this world who have almost nothing to eat. And then we have parts of the world where they dump tons of food on a daily basis. But coming closer to home, that also represents to me the challenge in our own country, where a part of our country was allowed to develop at a particular pace during the apartheid era, and a large part, by far the overwhelming majority, were excluded from it. And so that also speaks then to our own internal problem and our own internal divide. But the difficulty with this one is that in South Africa, in our case, the part at the top is a very small part relative to the numbers at the bottom. And so a total redistribution of the resources of the top part makes only a minimal difference to the lives at the bottom. And that's one of our problems. It's not as if you have a huge pool up there which, when redistributed, raises the level of standard of living for the majority. That pool can't do it because the majority is so big. Which tells me that there's only one way to deal with this. Only one way. And that is that group at the bottom, the majority at the bottom, take control of their own lives. With support, with the ways of wresting some resources from elsewhere, but essentially takes control for their own lives. And this is what was being offered to you as an introduction here. That this is about UWC deciding that we have a challenge here. And that challenge is a challenge shared by many South Africans and many people in sub-Saharan Africa. And there is no possibility of an outside force coming in and saying, we will do this for you, we'll take over this for you, and we'll sustain you. The world is in a position now where in actual fact we're going in the opposite direction. So this was the challenge that they issued us. It's a challenge that UWC has been trying to deal with in all kinds of ways. Our fees are the lowest in the country. In all kinds of ways we try and minimize the cost to our students in order to make it possible for them to live. But we know, given that history, that even at those levels it's impossible and very difficult. We know that there are student fees coming in, student fees we charge, and we try to keep those low. We know that there is a national scheme called NSFAS, which looks at how students are supported, but we know that only a percentage of our students, I can still play cricket, know that. Only a percentage of our students qualify, And even then, it doesn't cover all of their costs. So we have a real issue on this campus, as we have a real issue in South Africa, as we have a real issue in Sub-Saharan Africa, as we have a real issue in parts of many other parts of the world. And the question then is, how do we actually do this? And so part of my own response to this was to say, to imagine that all of the world, including us, could live at the levels of those at the top is fairy tale. It cannot and will not be. What is happening at that level is unsustainable. And we must find a level where we can live a sustainable life, which I believe is somewhere in the middle there. Somewhere in the middle. More or less, I believe, where UWC as a system might already be. This is about as good as it gets. And so the question for us is, how do we take what we've got and how do we deal with it so that each student at our university has a chance to succeed as a consequence of not having to be concerned with the fact that they have nothing, little or nothing to eat. And the fact that this is coming from a student, an organization which is essentially student-driven, called the Gender Equity Unit, also supported by what is happening in our residences under Mark Seals, where they have a program like this as well, and also supported by what is happening in the law faculty, where there's a program like that as well. And the important part for me in all of this is the fact that it is not a gift being given to someone that beggars that person. In both of these programs, both the Gender Equity Program and the program of the residences, there is reciprocity demanded. It's value for value. And if you don't do that, you make a beggar of the other and rob them of their dignity. And this is a very important element of this. So what it's asking simply is for those who can afford this, for those that have the extra, for those that go to bicycle twice a week, go only once, or takes a trip to the beach twice a week, go only once, or perhaps every second week, and take what you have in order to be part of the process of the redistribution and make it possible for UWC to live a life in which its students can operate with dignity and be successful. So I have given something. It's a small bit. I've promised to do so every month. And we're hoping that the entire institution will in some way contribute towards this, because if all South Africans take on this burden of sharing the challenge of sustainability, then we have a chance. Because the more people we can put through university, the more we can put through school successfully, the greater our capacity to understand the world we live in, and the greater our capacity to be able to build the skills and the technologies that we need in order to make a go of things. So that's just a short introduction, and now I'll take whichever questions come my way, and some of them I'll ask someone else to answer.
Okay, is there anybody who wants to ask questions? Raise your hand, don't be shy.
If they want to ask. As long as it's not about astronomy.